But that also leads me into the second part of that question, and I want to direct this for Dr. Fisher, is why is it that you think that most people, irrespective of race, because I know that I've been pulled over, and I feel like most people have a sort of nervousness, even when they're not doing anything wrong, that, it's just kind of like a natural reaction for almost everybody, I would say. I can't say everyone, but most people get kind of nervous when they get pulled over by the police. Why is it that you think that is?
Well, I often talk about us that even though we're one person, we often react and respond from many different ages and times and places in our life. We often associate the police as people of status power with authority. They, in essence, in that moment, become our parent. So in that time when we may feel that if we did something wrong or not, but we see lights go on or we pass an officer and we have that question, what emotions are evoked within us and how does that affect our perception of power in that moment? Often there's guilt. Did I do something wrong? And that results often in a quick release of adrenaline, of norepinephrine, excitatory neurotransmitters that send our level of anxiety a little higher. That's one part of it. The other standpoint is if we have a history with feelings of guilt, shame, failure, blame, our emotional pump is already primed to react and respond. So then what I tell people is you're not responding from your current age often, and this is really important for law enforcement to understand. You're responding from often a little kid place, a defiant teenager place, a flippant, young adult place, to where we're responding emotionally, not looking at our own social cues, because our emotion in essence has taken over. So because so many people are really not socially aware and even personally aware of their emotional reactions and responses, they can fall into these patterns almost beyond their will or desire or want because of that triggering. The other side of that, conversely, is how does that law enforcement officer respond when they run into somebody who might respond a little arrogantly, defiantly, angrily? Here are my 7 protective emotions that I teach. Anger, rage, arrogance, flippancy, defiance, sarcasm, and hatred are always, always protective, meaning they never come first and they never come alone. So whenever anybody sees somebody behaving with one of those emotions, they're protecting something. It often is guilt, shame, failure, fear. And that has to do more with the models of power I'll probably get to in another question. I don't want to take too much of this time, but I really want people to understand that the power of our emotions in those moments for everyone involved. And that's why there's so much turmoil these days, is because of these emotions. So long story short, Josh, that's kind of why people respond to me is really the emotion and really being able to learn to read our own emotions in the moment. And in that moment, as somebody who's in a position of authority, to have the insight and capability to fastly look at who your audience is and read what might be going on with them, why you still have to assess risk. That's a difficult ask for anybody to do.
Hey, Josh, can I jump in for a second, please?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Go ahead.
I'm going to go back, piggybacking off of what Dr. Fisher just mentioned, in that you referenced the mental health evaluations of law enforcement. Mm-hmm. That's one area that I don't think we've done a good job in within law enforcement. You have your initial psychiatric evaluation when you're hired as a law enforcement officer, but there's no ongoing psychiatric evaluation unless you're involved in some type of deadly force encounter, for the most part. I personally believe, having been in homicide, having been, a robbery detective and the department spokesman in Gwinnett County, that so many things happen on a regular basis every single day in this country. Even right now, while we're sitting in the comfort of our offices and homes, officers are out answering 911 calls. And people aren't calling 911 because their cat is in the tree. So they're seeing some of the most heinous, violent things that this society has to offer. And so I personally believe, and I'm sure the doctor would agree, that officers should have at least psychiatric evaluations every 6 months. just check their temperature, make sure that there aren't any things that are bothering them that may be able to be ironed out.
I agree, and I'm glad you brought that up, because after I finished the answer, I realized I neglected really to respond on your side of the police officer, the law enforcement officer side of it. There's a saying I often use is death by 1,000 paper cuts. And when you look at post-traumatic stress and trauma, you can have somebody who has experienced 1,000 small traumas that add up to the essence of one big trauma. And if the theme is the same, it erodes that person's ability to feel safe, their ability to trust. It results in chronic increased stress levels, higher levels of excitatory neurotransmitters, which wear out the adrenal glands, all these physical effects and emotional effects. And you're exactly right. There might be a threshold where they were great when they came onto the job. They tested out perfectly, no issues, but over time, the system eroded them. Now, the difficulty is, how do we support those officers versus just saying, you're a risk, you have to get off the street? Because that encourages the fake good profiles where people are going to say anything. That also encourages a culture where you have collusion among officers to keep their mouths quiet if they see a problem. We have to build more trusting communities, not to identify people and vilify them or point out only what's wrong, but to point out the things that are going on so that they can acknowledge the help they need, continue to maybe do their job in a modified way, or to have ongoing support systems and groups where it is socially acceptable and not stigmatizing an officer to say, I'm having a rough time and I need to work it through. Because I know through doing my job, when people are able to release their stress and they work the issues through, a lot of the challenges fall away. They do, because they're not holding it all in. It's not that balloon that's going to pop. And that's something that as attorneys, we can help affect that, I believe. As judges, we can affect that in the system. As police officers, as agents, and even us in our community, to say, we have to respect the challenge of the job that people we want to look out for us have, in order to support us through and be our collaborative friends and neighbors and partners, versus people who feel like they have to watch their back all the time. And that's unfortunately what I feel like a lot of people may be feeling, or officers may be feeling these days.
Can I ask
Josh, you also had, Josh, initially during your question was part of why do people get nervous or have that reaction when they're encountering a police officer. One of the things that was frustrating for me as an officer is the culture created by bad officers. That's the biggest thing, because even when I was just off duty out and about, I have to be very, very conscious of the fact that I'm a Black man. And having worked side by side with many, what I would term bad apples, my reaction is that of nervousness whenever I'm approached by an officer. The difference is, as Mr. Washington stated, to being kind and courteous. I spoke to Mr. Lewis some time back, and one of the things that I've had to learn is that no matter what type of day this officer may be having, when he or she approaches me, I learned that it is bigger than I am. And I have to sit and realize that I have to live through this situation. And one of the things with me living through the situation is, Lewis would say I'm old school. I carry an ink pen around with me. And I learned that at the end of the day, if I can live to tell the story, I can write out everything that happened. The sheriff, the chief of police, the city council chairman, the county commission chair, all of those people you can copy in this complaint against these officers. It may not get the officer out of office today, but there needs to be a track record where you don't need 30 plus complaints in an officer's file. That's the sort of thing that leads to a great deal of mistrust in the community, because this officer is bad. The supervisors know who every bad officer is in an agency. if at the beginning of the year, when the shift rotations come around, every supervisor sits there with his or her finger crossed, saying, "Don't let me get this 2 or 3." The co-workers know who the bad officers are. And it is one of the things. It's easy to say we need training, we need all of these different things, but the truth is that we need to get rid of people when they show who they are. That's the biggest issue with policing and society, is bad officers not being gotten rid of until they kneel on somebody's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and then it's a problem. Now, and that goes into other stuff which you didn't ask at this point, but chiefs and sheriffs, I don't know what type of issues repercussions they can face from the governing agencies within the state. But if they keep holding on to troublemakers, there has to be some accountability from the top that would help cut out a lot of this foolishness. I have encountered officers out and about riding with my wife, just riding around, but I'm in a bad area. Okay, well, this is where my grandmother used to live before she passed away. My wife never met my grandmother. I'm taking her around, hey, look, this is where I grew up at. These are the places. Oh, what you doing over here? I get asked this about 8 times during the encounter. And then when I let my department ID show, oh, brother, oh, man, you should have told you, hey, he's good, he's one of us. And all of a sudden, I'm okay. It doesn't matter that I'm still in a bad area. Now I'm cool. That foolishness has to go, because it makes it dangerous for the good officers out there. And there will never be a good situation for the public to trust the police. And as long as that kind of stuff continues to go on, thank you. I know that's not all you asked, but that's my feelings on it.
I appreciate that answer, because that brings me right into the next follow-up that I have from Mr. Kyle Jones.
Hey, Larry, Mr. Lewis, did you want to answer? I saw you would want to.
That's a question of both Deion Washington and Kyle Jones. Does the street have a shelf life? You know what I mean by that, right? Does riding around in that black and white and turning on the blue lights, does that have a shelf life? I find that most things have a shelf life. Raising teenagers is like, 7 years, 13, 14, 15. By the time they hit 19, you move on to something else. Beans, everything has a shelf life. Does riding around in that black and white, irrespective of whatever counseling you might get, does that have a shelf life?
Well, first, Josh in the panel, let me first apologize. I had to admit my father in the hospital at 7 o'clock this morning. That's for being late. But so I can go ahead and start answering the question. In my 25 years, I've known some uniform officers to have been there before I got there, and some of them are still there, and they do a good job at that. It depends on the individual. Change is good in every career, but sometimes you have that officer that's he gets accustomed to his neighborhood. He works his beat. He's familiar with his territory, and he really believes in community-oriented policing. And then on the other hand, you do have situations where some individuals get burnt out. I think that goes back to the question that was asked earlier, and a doctor brought up about these officers receiving psychological evaluations during the course of their career, not just at the onset. But to answer your question, Mr. Lawrence, I believe that it depends on the individual and what their career path looks like for them.
Okay, so when Detective Washington says, and I'm gonna keep calling him detective because he's detective for me, when he says that you should get the counseling every 6 months, yes, to make sure where your head is based on what you're seeing every 6 months, you might agree with that, but you don't necessarily say in 5 years we got to really look at should this person come off the street or not.
Well, yeah, well, not 6 months. You know, in DeKalb County, you know, our officers got evaluations every year. And, you know, as a supervisor, one of the things that we sat down and counseled them was, you know, on what direction they wanted their career to go in. We counseled them if they had a certain amount of complaints and use of force reports. And working in internal affairs, we had what they call the early warning sign, that if individuals got certain number of use of force reports and a certain number of complaints, we pulled them in off the streets and evaluated, you know, the actions and try to come up with a corrective action plan to get them on the right path. You know, as a commander of internal affairs, it was my philosophy, not so much the agency philosophy, to train individuals up or train them out. If they wasn't fit for the job, we had to get rid of them. So I say that every 6 months, you know, to counsel them, you know, you take a gauge on that and counsel them for their yearly evaluation and see what it is. But I don't think at 5 years you turn around and say, hey, let's just shake everybody up and move along.
I got a question on that too, about in terms of one of the issues I think we run into in terms of why corruption continues is because we have personal relationships with people, that the ethics, the values, the rule structures that are in place are often relaxed because we have these emotional connections. We might like them as friends. We have histories. We know their wives, their kids. We know the struggles they have. So we excuse that. How does one in positions of leadership in law enforcement, or how do we create the culture in law enforcement to say, we're in this together to help our community, and we have to see the value of making sure that people are getting help who need it, and that this friendship idea of moving somebody through or ignoring a problem because we like them is something that should be excused.
Yeah, well, Doc, now you're speaking directly, you know, to things I have a great issue with. When you look at the command structure of the police department, the person in that department with the less amount of power is the police chief, because he's majority controlled by either the CEO, the mayor, or the city council. The sergeants and the lieutenants and the captains, they're the ones that are creating that culture that you're speaking of to protect the line officer, because i.e. maybe they policed with his father, or they policed with his mother, or they like him and they show him favoritism. You know, that's the culture that we have to get in, and I always sought out to, you know, to change. Irregardless of your relationship, I always looked at the individual, and I caught flack for that, but I handled and I dealt with that flack. But that's the culture right there that needs to, you know, that needs to change. When I hear the terms of a supervisor saying, hey, my officer, or my officer this, or my officer that, he's not your officer. You know, this is not personal. He belongs to the agency. You know, he's there for you to supervise and make sure that he's out there doing the right things, make sure he's on his right path. But in no form, when you talk to him, you know, and I hear him say, you know, my supervisor, they're already putting up to me that boundary of protection. Mm-hmm. I mean, from my experience.